Welcome back to Power of the Mind, the podcast where we give you simple tools to improve your relationship with yourself and with others. In today's podcast, we do a deep dive into the fight, flight, and freeze responses. We explain how those responses happen, what happens in your body biologically when you shift from fight, flight into the freeze area of the brain. It's really, really interesting and also very informative for people who've been through traumatic events to help them understand how and why they responded the way they did. Hope you stay tuned.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Talking Glass Media and Cast 11, Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare and our host, Greg Struve. How's it going?
Hooray. Oh man, it's going great. I'm excited to talk about PTSD today.
We're in it.
Yeah,
we are in it.
We're going to do a deep dive into the freeze response today, which I think will be really informative and useful. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about how a person gets into a freeze response and what it feels like to be in a freeze response. And for people who have a lot of freeze on board, it can be very informative and very helpful. So
it was helpful listening to you on the last episode where you brought that up, because I've only heard of fight or flight.
Oh, yeah.
You got two choices. You're going to fight or you're going to run. But now we know there's a third choice.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting to understand the physiology of the fight, flight, freeze system. There's a couple different systems that come into play with a human being. Fight, flight, and freeze is one of them. Then there's a thing called the attachment system. The attachment system is about the manner in which we go about getting our needs met by our primary caregivers. Then there's the reproductive system, which involves sexuality and all those pieces. And there's a couple other systems that come into play. But those are some of the big heavy hitters in terms of psychology. So a lot of times we talk about our unconscious. And you can think about your unconscious mind in a lot of different ways. One of my favorite ways is just to think about the part of myself that does what it wants to do, even when I don't want to do it. Okay? If I get really into my M&Ms and I've decided to myself, you know what, I'm going to only have 3 M&Ms. By the time I'm done, the bag of M&Ms is gone. Mm-hmm. What happened there? What's going on? How did that happen? That's the piece of myself that I'm not aware of. My unconscious is one of the ways they talk about it in the context of psychology. And the fight-flight system plays a big part in that for a lot of us. So talking about that today can help us really understand ourselves and understand other people. One thing that's really evident to me as I continue my own journey of healing and exploration is that we are all really, really complex. There's a lot to us. There is you can go inward for a very, very, very long time and still have space left to go and still have things to learn, as far as I can tell. And I think that's really interesting. So anyhow, when we talk about fight, flight, the nervous system, this particular set of features of the nervous system, when it's at rest, we're in a state of social engagement and play. Not always playful necessarily, but we're at our most relaxed and kind of at our most spontaneous and authentic self. The state of social engagement is the basic level of the nervous system. And so that is how we start out, at least a lot of the time in life. Some of us come from really difficult backgrounds and we might not spend much time in social engagement. But when things are going well, everything's happening. You can think about some of your most rewarding experiences from your past, and a lot of times they'll involve a group of family or friends, and they'll involve a time when you felt very spontaneous and free and not particularly self-conscious. And that's what social engagement is at its best. There's varying levels of social engagement, but that's what the nervous system does when it doesn't have anything to worry about it. Or anything to worry about, pardon. My yard, we have a lawn. We live in the valley in Phoenix, and we have a big lawn, and for whatever reason, the bunnies in the neighborhood have decided to kind of adopt our lawn, and we have a lot of bunnies. So it's really interesting to see what they do when they're not worried about anything. They love to play and frolic, and the aforementioned reproductive system does come into play with some regularity with the bunnies. And it's fun to see what they do and how they play and how they kind of enjoy each other and enjoy just being a bunny.
When they're not trying to stay alive.
Right. But then you open the door, or you make a noise in the house, or you knock on the window, and something different happens. Yeah, they take a look around, and the first thing they do is they attune to whatever that sound is. And inside that, on the outside of the nervous system, it looks like they're going to pause to assess the threat. And the other thing that's interesting is if one bunny pauses, all of them will lock onto the one bunny who paused if they don't see the threat.
Huh.
Herd animals will do that. A gazelle, if the gazelles are all out kind of grazing and hanging out, right? And one gazelle pops his head up, oh, what is that? Or if you and I right now, we're sitting here talking, but if there's a big noise outside, we would orient our bodies to the noise, and then we would try to decide how big of a threat it was and what we should do. And as soon as we do that, we start engaging the fight-flight system. And we're up here, and we are nervous. And that's the first level of the fight-flight system turning on. Now, that's the flight part of it. I'm a little nervous. What's that big noise? Is it a threat? In other situations, if I'm feeling particularly confident for whatever reason, and there's a big noise, or perhaps I think I already know where it's coming from or why it's there, and I might feel annoyed. And that, again, is the very first stage of the fight-flight process. And then depending on what happens outside of my environment, I might become more and more activated. We talk about the nervous system being activated. We don't talk about it necessarily. I might get more angry or I might get more afraid. The two are pretty interchangeable depending on what you realize. For example, you might start out annoyed because you think your kid is making a big noise outside, and you go outside to investigate the noise and to put a stop to it and to teach that little whippersnapper a lesson, and then you realize that you're actually in an emergency situation. And now the same system is on board, but you have changed your focus from anger to fear. So we don't talk about the nervous system as being afraid or as being angry. We talk about it as just being activated, the amount of activation in the nervous system. And the amount of activation correlates roughly with the heart rate. The more activation, the higher the heart rate gets. Okay, at the highest level. So we can go all the way up the scale. We go nervous, we go afraid, we go, terrified. There's probably a couple in between there, adjective-wise. I can't think of any other adjectives that would fit there. Nervous, fearful, afraid, anxious,
scared,
very scared. And somewhere on the realm of things, we move up the scale to terrified. We go from annoyed to frustrated to angry, and then eventually to rage at the top. And so this part of the nervous system is really, really interesting. Your body is really amazing in terms of what it does. So at social engagement, you're sitting with a normal standing, sitting heart rate. And your heart rate for most people is between 60 and 100 beats a minute, roughly. And if you're in really good shape, maybe it'll be a little bit lower, but 60 to 100 beats a minute. As you go up the scale from nervous to afraid to very scared to terrified, your heart rate will increase and increase and increase and increase. At the top, you're talking about it's really moving. And the reason it's doing that is it's taking all of your blood and moving it to your extremities. And it's taking everything out of, for example, the nervous system will immediately shut down digestion and immediately shut down the reproductive system because you don't need any of those things if you're about to either run like hell or get into a big battle. Like, it's not doing you any good to digest food. The human body works with osmosis, right? It absorbs food. It takes about a day from the time that your nutrients enter your body to the time they get to the cells and get everywhere. So it just shuts all that stuff down. I'm not going to bother with that. Instead, we're going to motivate and take all of our energy and put it into our extremities. Okay, our eyes are going to narrow. We're going to develop tunnel vision so we can focus either on where we need to be instead of here, or on what we need to kill. And that's really what the nervous system is designed to do at that point. The further up the scale you go, as far as annoyed, frustrated, angry, and rageful, the more sort of harm the system is designed to do. And the other thing that happens is the logic in your cerebral cortex is really actually a pretty slow system. It's kind of new. It's only been around for, a couple millennia here, But the part of you that moves on instinct, the part of you that goes fast, it is quite a bit quicker. We bypass all kinds of stuff and we start to move on instinct. And this is where people who have a lot of training in some sort of self-defense thing or military training or whatever, that's why you do all that training, is because when the going gets tough, your instinct needs to be stuff that is conducive to you being effective in an emergency situation. Most of us don't have that necessarily. And so we go to just our sort of basic instincts. And in terms of the flight response, for example, when you're really terrified, you actually make really terrible decisions. You'll get the heck out of the room you're in as fast as you can, but you won't pick a better room or a good place. You won't make a decision that makes sense necessarily. You just know one very simple thing. I'm here. I need to be somewhere else. That door represents somewhere else. I'm going out that door. What's on the other side? It's not a conversation you've had with yourself at that point, right? Same thing with the rage, okay? I am being threatened, and I need to attack. And I need to attack, you'll have situations where people will get into a really difficult spot, and they'll realize when they were done that they had a gun next to them. They just didn't think about it. They just went after the person with their fists or whatever. There's all sorts of different situations that you'll hear about like that, because again, the brain at that point gets EMTs. I did a training with a person who was an EMT one time, a first responder, and she said, when you get into an accident or you get into trouble, your body gets strong and you get stupid. I call it strong and stupid. All the adrenaline moves through the body. There's a bunch of other cool stuff that happens in terms of how your body processes oxygen and all the different chemical stuff that happens, right? But anyway, you become a lean, mean fighting machine, and your body corrals all of the resources it has toward getting you attacking or running right away. And it happens, I want to say it's like a 30th of a second or something like that. It happens really fast, really fast. And so here's what's interesting about all this stuff is we will often get into these situations with loved ones. The most common time that we enter into fight flight is when? Oh, it's a domestic dispute with my spouse, right? And so then I can say things like, I can just say at any given point in time the absolute meanest, most vicious thing I can think of to this person who 5 minutes ago I loved dearly, right? Mm-hmm. That's the verbal version of this process. And then when I'm done, I think, oh my gosh, who was that guy? Who said that? Who did that? Oh no, that's me, right? That's just a part of you you're not as familiar with. Mm-hmm. It's not as sophisticated. It's not as friendly. One of my favorite theoreticians always says, recognize that when you're around a child, you should treat yourself like a loaded weapon, because you have the ability to, kids make us angry and they have more or less no defense. And so it's really easy to get to rage and to unleash and unload on a child because your nervous system knows there's no consequence to you. And that's been the sort of de facto method of parenting we've used for the last couple thousand years. It's not It's not awesome.
No.
Yeah, but it is pretty standard.
Well, and we put dads in that role too, right? Wait till your dad gets home.
Oh yeah. Because
when your dad gets home and dad walks in and now he's got to be, the guy, right?
Yeah. So yeah, this is the process that happens when a person jumps into fight flight mode into their brain. The other thing is the farther up the scale you get, the less access you have to your cerebral cortex and to your capacity to be rational. And that's where you get people who will black out with rage or black out in terror. They literally, some folks can turn off access to the cerebral cortex completely and be operating on complete instinct. And then things get really interesting, because if you are in a fight-flight situation, and particularly flight, if you get to a point where it ain't working and it's very apparent that you're going to get caught, or you're in rage and you're losing the battle, you're getting punched more than you're punching, then the brain has a second system that it uses. So fight-flight is the first system. The second system is called freeze. And when freeze turns on, sort of the opposite of everything that just happened happens. Now freeze your brain will trigger when it decides it's no longer safe to fight or to flee. I read one time that happens based on the level of oxygenation in your blood. You have to do your own research to figure out what that level is or how that works exactly. But you get to a point where your nervous system says, yeah, this isn't going to work. If you're a kid, you get to that point pretty quick.
Right.
Most of the time, especially if you're in an inescapable situation. And this is what we call dissociation. Freeze is dissociation. Now, freeze is really interesting because it has that same experience that you have in fight-flight, where it takes over the physiology and everything changes. Now, before, your heart rate was at 210 beats a minute and just really moving all that stuff around and getting you what you needed. Well, if we think about it from a biological perspective, freeze shows up right before the lion's jaws sink into your flesh. You know what I mean? Freeze is like, well, didn't work. What do we do now? Well, we can go about playing possum. We shut the whole system down. Well, what you don't want in that situation is real high blood pressure, because we're going to assume biologically that there's been some sort of puncture wound. Okay, so the freeze response drops your blood pressure, drops your heart rate down to very, very, very low. Actually, sometimes it can get so low that we talk about being scared to death. That's the phenomenon of being actually scared to death. I don't think that happens very often, and it's not particularly functional biologically, but it is possible to have the blood pressure drop to that degree, right? The nervous system can shut you down. Most of the time, instead, you just shut down, okay? And all the blood pools in your chest cavity and in your stomach around your vital organs, because that's what we need to keep you alive as long as possible. All non-essential functioning starts to shut down. Early on in freeze, you'll just feel a little foggy. You feel a sense of dissociation and disconnect. But as it goes on, this is also traditionally referred to as shock. Okay, it can, you'll start to lose your sight, lose touch, various sensations and senses will turn off. That's how the freeze response works. And people will often find themselves jumping outside their body. For a lot of my clients, this is an experience, it's very uncomfortable, or not uncomfortable isn't the right word. It's actually quite comfortable. Freeze is very comfortable. You release a bunch of analgesic chemicals into your body that are sometimes more potent than opiates that we give people. Like, your body can numb you out really, really effectively. Not for as long as you might like, unfortunately, but it'll save you from an awful lot of pain. And so you're painless, and then you'll actually jump out of your body a lot of the time and have a chance. And I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who've been in the middle of some awful, horrifying event in their life and say, I stood up by the ceiling and I watched it. I saw it happening. Or sometimes my dissociation can take me to sort of a happier place. And I'm going to think about, I had a client who used to think about a particular cartoon she liked, right? She'd just go play with the Care Bears. And that was it. And then wait for everything to be done. And so mercifully, nature appears to allow us to leave our body before death, at least some of the time. I don't know. At least biologically, we leave the physical experience of the sensation of the body behind at some level. There's not a lot of doubt or question about that, I don't think. And so, we spend a bunch of time up here in freeze. Now, here's what's interesting when we're talking about the freeze response and being in dissociation. Biologically, everything is shifted and changed, right? But all of the distress that is here is still here. It's still going on. And so one of the challenges I get is there's a whole process that my body goes through to release all this stuff after the threat is gone. If I do live and come down, I will find my body extremely distressed when I come back into it. And it will want to move a lot. Well, if I'm injured, if I have a back injury, for example, what do the paramedics do? They say, don't move. Which actually is probably a good plan a lot of the time. However, that material is going to stay there. And you can think of it like I told you before, there's some sort of blood oxygenation level thing that flips the switch from fight, flight to freeze, right? Well, there's some other switch in there that gets turned down and turned off when you're no longer in danger. But it doesn't matter that you think you're no longer in danger, and it doesn't matter that it's obvious to you that no one in the room will damage you. Your nervous system waits until all of these automatic responses that got kicked out during the traumatic or dangerous event, until they have sort of left one way or another, until they have the shaking and the heat and the cold and the trembling, and the anger and the pain and the sadness and all these different things. When they have left, then that switch flips. Before they leave, if they don't leave and you try to go back to the regular life, you have a lot of people in the world who are just always at a certain level of fight flight. And we call that an anxiety disorder. Okay.
Wow.
Now, again, that's not to say every single anxiety disorder is a part of trauma. There's a lot of myriad things that can cause depression. But guess what we call it when somebody's stuck in freeze? Well, it's depression. Right? Freeze looks a lot like depression. You let people who say everything in my life is working, everything's fine and fun, and I just feel empty. I feel a sense of nothingness. I don't feel anything. My friends cry at their funerals. I go to funerals and I'm just kind of here. I cry because I'm supposed to, but inside I know I'm faking it. I wonder what's wrong with me. Oh, well, you grew up in a situation that was terrifying. You needed to tune into your environment all the time, and you just shut everything down. You're in freeze all the time.
You're stuck that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And so that's one way of thinking about what is PTSD. PTSD can be thought about as being stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, or sometimes both. And trauma resolution is often about renegotiation between the systems inside the body that control how much fight, flight, and how much freeze we are in at any given time. So that's where, and this is also where some people have a hair trigger as far as moving up the scale from frustrated to angry to rage. Well, if I've been at a place, my fight-flight system is already running at a 5 out of 10 all the time, every day. If I just live in that place of anger and fear and rage, which in certain contexts is actually a really good idea. There's certain cultures in the world and certain places in the world where being angry most of the time is pretty safe. For jail, for example, a lot of guys I work with come out of jail or prison.
Well, and just like when I think of fight or flight and being at a 5 or 6 all the time, a soldier, which is where PTSD,
100%.
We've talked about, that was my original, PTSD, soldiers, right? Because they have to operate at that 5, or they have to be on alert all the time.
100%. Yeah,
Wow.
when you walk into battle, I've had a couple different experiences working with folks who have some combat trauma, and both coming out of Afghanistan, and the experience of just the knowledge that it could be you today. Yesterday it was a guy who you knew from boot camp, who you hadn't seen in a little while, but you heard about it, and there's no reason it couldn't be you today. You don't get to pick, you don't get to choose, you don't see it coming. That IED, there are IEDs in the road for sure.
Somebody's
getting blown up, and it might be you, it might not be you, and you have to be in that place. And then you come back to peacetime, and you come back to the regular world, and your body says to stay at that level of activation. And remember too, particularly when it's accompanied with a little bit of anger and the self-protective response of anger is activating, and it also feels pretty good. It has a certain, there's actually some chemicals attached to it, and so it can be a little addicting. And regular life after you've had that for several months is pretty boring. It doesn't have quite the same.
Which is why you'll see people re-enlist, where you're like,
Sure.
why you were home, you were free, but they've gotten so adapt to that lifestyle or that adrenaline rush for normal everyday life.
It's also why you see a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, or sex addiction too. Sex, certain kinds of sex are very intense and can release, and certain kinds of sex also can be very settling. Orgasm is a very settling experience for people, and so you'll see a lot of that happening with folks who have any kind of trauma, but particularly the battlefield stuff. So
interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, you hear a lot of it. My frame of reference is pretty much just things you see on TV or whatever, but that out of body experience. When this was happening, I just took myself to another place, or or you'll see something bad will happen and you can remember standing above and watching it because there's nothing else. But I never knew like what that was either. You know, it's just
that's the freeze response. Yeah.
Crazy.
And during the freeze response, your body goes varying degrees of immobile. It can be completely immobilized or only lethargic.
But then when the danger's gone and you need to go into action, you just don't know where to.
Very long time. You come out, you feel disoriented. You feel like your body doesn't work. You can't see straight. You can't think straight. You feel like you're in a fog, right?
Yeah.
That's how the freeze response works.
And you do dumb things. It's like, oh, let me help. But you're doing the dumbest things to try to help the situation.
Sure.
You brought up something where your people they're training for, something bad to happen, or they're getting ready. And I knew a person who took gun classes. And they would reenact like high tense situations where it's like, okay, when this goes off, you're in it, right? And you've got to shoot the targets and don't hit the good guys and only hit the bad targets. And they were telling the story of how, all right, here we go. And they're doing like a real life reenactment of it. And he just froze. And when they got done, they were like, what happened? He goes, I was waiting for the buzzer to go off. So, like when you're in training, they'll hit the buzzer and it's time to go. Yeah. And it was just, no matter how much you try to reenact a real life situation, you don't know how your body's going to respond. He was waiting for the, bzz, or the go, and so it was just, no matter, I don't think however prepared you can be, for a normal person who just doesn't operate at the level of like a soldier or a firefighter or a police officer.
Well, it's revealing too, because we start to recognize that on top of all of this, or maybe underneath of all of this sophisticated intellectual stuff that we think is us, when stuff gets rough, we very much become an animal, or we revert to our animal side, so to speak. And whatever has been habituated will show up. And if nothing has been habituated, then what shows up will be just instinct.
Right.
It'll be what's been there in the past. And the system will do something, and it'll do it fast.
Right.
And it might not do it great, but it'll do it.
Right.
And so that's the piece that we can take away from that, is just the recognition that there's a lot going on here. And that's part of the reason I think it can be so challenging to be a human being, is because our intellects are ferociously powerful, like amazing tools. Our brains are, and they're sitting on top of the architecture of, there's the mammal part of the brain that's common with almost all mammals. There's a lizard piece in there. The architecture of a lizard is built in there too. And it's just a pretty complex situation. You're a remarkably complex human being. And in order to survive, we have to simplify both ourselves and each other, right? We can't sit and contemplate all this stuff every day. We have to decide whether it's McDonald's or Burger King, and how to get the kids to school on time. And we have to make a myriad, tens of thousands of other decisions all the time. So we have to have a shorthand. But when you really sit down and look at it, you are a remarkably complex creature with an incredible array of material, very little of which you're aware of most of the time.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, and I love the whiteboard. So if you're only listening to us on the podcast, we'll have a link to where you can actually see the
I might even zoom in on
the
that
drawing
a little bit.
Yeah, because it's interesting to kind of see just how, and I love that the freeze response, it's almost like it was okay, to react the way you did. That was normal to do that. And I think that had to be very reassuring for somebody to hear that, if you were in this horrible situation, you were in a car crash, or you were wherever, and you did not know how to handle it, or you couldn't.
Right.
And so instead of sitting there for years going, gosh, why didn't I could have fought this person, or I could have ran, or, you're just in it, or you couldn't, protect anybody. It's very comforting to hear it wasn't your fault. Your brain protected you the best way it could, and this is what happened. So
yeah, particularly when you hear stories about soldiers in war who go into freeze in difficult situations, many armies will kill them. You just get executed for that.
Yeah, you didn't do anything.
Yeah. If you're not doing any good, you're not helping your guys.
Sworn duty, right? You're supposed to.
Off you go. So yeah, but there's lots of situations where that'll come up, or, if I understand why my fight-flight system is so strong, that can be very helpful. You still need to get some help for it. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of trouble in this life. But yeah, it can be useful.
Yeah, interesting, especially that reacclimating to normal life, right?
I do always like to point out things that are interesting. One of the fun parts is there's a threshold between social engagement and fight-flight. And when you go over it, you get kind of wired up. And we're all at some level of fight-flight. I don't think there are very many human beings who live in social engagement all the time. But most of us are in a certain level of fight-flight when we're out in public. One of the characteristics when you're working with a nervous system and you want to figure out, have we settled something? Have we resolved a small piece of the puzzle? A spontaneous deep breath, the kind you have when you meditate regularly, okay? Not a planned deep breath where you take deep breaths to meditate, but if you are meditating, you will have that kind of a sigh is a sign that you've gone into from a certain level of fight-flight and the social engagement. And then the other surefire, well, there's a couple of them. Another one is yawning, right? A yawn is a sign that your nervous system is down-regulating and has moved from a certain level of activation to a certain level of settledness. And so we yawn at night when we're ready for bed. Well, guess what? If you're in a fight-flight situation, sleep is not a high priority.
Right.
Freeze actually does feel very sleepy, but that's a different situation. So, and then why are yawns contagious? Well, we're pack animals. We're herd animals, right? And so if somebody in the herd is settled enough to yawn, well, then I probably can be settled enough to yawn too. I mean, we're probably all going to be okay here. If you're going to downregulate, maybe I can downregulate too. I think, in fact, I will.
So that's just how you started when the rabbit or somebody goes on alert. They all look to that person as to what's going on. And so same thing.
Totally.
Oh, it's okay to...
And then the other thing to recognize too, we talk about all of our anxiety disorders and all the challenges we have with anxiety in the world. And you have to remember your anxiety is kind of your friend. I think it's really worthwhile to acknowledge your anxiety. One of the first things I'll do clinically is I'll say, well, let's say thank you to that anxiety for trying to keep your ass alive. Because that's what it's been doing. Because you have to remember, and I think I've mentioned this on the show before, but if that bunny hears the twig crack 100 times, and he doesn't react the 100th time, the 1 out of 100 times, it's a predator.
Yep.
If he doesn't react to all 100, there's a chance that he becomes, and a decent chance, that he becomes food. So your anxiety is your friend. It's trying to keep you alive. It's going to over-identify threat. That's our job. Your nervous system doesn't give a shit if you're happy. Not really. It'll let you be happy if everything else seems to be okay. But first, it's going to check long and hard to see if there's anything it can identify as a threat in your immediate environment so that you can make sure that if that twig cracks and it's the one time out of 100 or one time out of 1,000 that it's a predator, your DNA gets to keep going.
Yep.
That's its job. Its job is to keep your butt alive. I'm cussing a lot here toward the end. I was going to say ass.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
So that's the thing that can be really helpful. I think spend a lot of time trying to fight off. People say I'm working on it. What they really mean is I'm fighting it. I'm fighting my anxiety, my depression, my mental health. Well, you do want to do some work on it, but before you get started, you might want to tell it thanks. It's just trying its best to keep you alive. Now we don't live in the woods anymore, most of us anyway. Although there is that cool show Alone. You ever see that show Alone on A&E?
Oh, yeah.
They drop those guys and gals out in the woods.
You gotta get out?
No, you don't have to get out. You just stay there.
Oh, you just stay?
Yeah, you stay there for as long as you can. Whoever stays the longest wins $500,000.
I think I could stay for a little while for $500,000.
$500,000? I don't know, man. I remember they had a guy that dropped in there one time. And the first night, some bears came sniffing.
Okay, yeah, I'm done.
And he called in the morning. He was like, I'm good. I'm not interested in being dead. I'm going to tap out. And they came and got him.
So nobody's protecting these people? It's like you could really die? It's not like Survivor where you just call a medic or something?
Well, they have a satellite phone, and they call the phone, and somebody comes with a helicopter to pick them up, and they bring a doctor.
But you're done.
But they set up the cameras, and the bears came, and the bears were sniffing at the at the tent.
Oh, my gosh.
And they were cubs. But where there's cubs, there's a mom.
Where there's babies, there's a mean old mama protecting those cubs.
It gets pretty real. It's all fun and games until you realize you're not at the top of the food chain.
Oh my gosh.
It's so fun. We all spend a lot of time being like, nature's so great. I love nature.
Nature will kill you.
I love being in nature. And nature is great. And nature is wonderful. And nature will kill you. Nature is trying to kill you more or less all the time. And if you're not paying attention to that, you can get into some trouble.
Oh, Mother Nature's relentless, right?
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's so funny. Most of our culture is designed to keep us, we lament being separate from nature. And rightly so, we will find ourselves feeling better when we're in nature, but nature is much more fun when you're at the top of the food chain.
As I say, you might want to be right in that fight or flight.
Yeah,
let's go on this nice little nature walk.
It's all fun and games until you're not at the top of the food chain, and then
so you're walking backwards with sticks in your hand.
Then the four walls of your house look pretty good at that point.
My couch is pretty nice right now.
Yeah,
totally. On TV.
I'll take a couch.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for this.
Sure,
I love that.
It's fun. It's fun to look into and to understand. It can help us have some more compassion for ourselves.
When we first started talking about PTSD, I had no idea it was going to take us I just honestly thought it was going to be soldiers and military. I had no idea it was domestic survivors and, children from trauma that are experiencing this. I just always associated it with war, and that was it.
We'll do one more at least where we talk about what is psychological trauma, because it gets overused but then underused sometimes too. We can do a lot better if we're aware of what constitutes trauma. We'll have to cover that next time, but this trauma is the underlying cause of PTSD. So
trauma seems to be the underlying cause of many things.
Well, that's the fun part too, is we all try to get as far away from trauma as we can. Trauma's bad, but it's inescapable because your nervous system is going to find the most threatening thing in your environment, even if it's not threatening. That's why I tell people, I say, you can try to be good to your kids, but no matter how sort of comfortable an environment we live in, we will always find something to be scared of. We are wired to do it that way. Our body has to find the most
keep you alive, right?
Most dangerous part of the environment is going to be a big hunk of our focal point. That's how we have survived for, things have been pretty good the last 100 years or so, but prior to that, it was pretty rough. Pretty rough for 95% of the population. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, 95% of the population lived in abject poverty, absolute poverty.
Yeah, there are times, but it's very rare where I'll just be like, wow, I'm really happy right now. And you're almost afraid to say that because it's like, if you admit to the universe that you're happy or something's like, don't even speak that. Don't even say it because, it's almost as if your body goes into, okay, well, how do I got to bring this girl down. Like, what can we do to regulate that? Yeah.
That's a normal response. Yeah.
I'm learning.
Well, and that's, again, you get happy and then the nervous system, because it's true. That's the reality of being a human being, is everybody dies. Entropy takes everything. No matter what you have, eventually it will go. That's just the nature of the beast. So, and acceptance of that actually probably is what creates happiness. I really enjoy Michael Singer's talks, and he talks a lot about the idea of how our preferences actually create an awful lot of suffering in our lives, and choosing to accept what is a great tool to find happiness. So I like him.
Interesting.
Smart dude.
Well, we've got a whole bunch more PTSD talk in front of us.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
I'm excited too.
On that happy note of doom and gloom, and you're for sure going to die. But in the meantime,
that's always a nice way to wrap up. We should do that with every podcast.
Everyone. Yeah.
Just a reminder. Everyone dies.
Everyone dies. Yeah. But tune in again next week. We tell you how to live a little bit better than you were yesterday. So, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Power the Mind with Greg Struve and Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. Always interesting. Yeah. And always, I learn something every single time. So,
and if you have any questions, you can check us out at granitemountainbhc.com, or you can go to my website, gregstruve.com, and contact me through there. And we always love hearing from you.
Awesome. Well, I've been fighting a yawn for about the last 10 minutes because you talked about it.
Down-regulate.
You talked about it, and I'm like, oh, don't do it. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next time.
If you have a question or something you'd like us to discuss here on Power of the Mind, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is stories, STORIES, at signalsaz.com. That's stories, STORIES, at signals, SIGNALS, AZ.com. Look forward to hearing from you.